Thank you, Georgina. So hello, everybody. Thank you so much for coming. Apologies for the slight delay in the start. We couldn't work out the Zoom sharing. And thank you very much to Georgina and the ASDS for hosting me. So I'm currently a research fellow at the University of Plymouth, but today I'm talking about the sociology research that I did for my ESRC-funded PhD and postdoc at the University of Exeter. And this was investigating second trimester pregnancy loss in England. And I know this can be a difficult subject, so please dip out if you need to during the talk. So my plan today is to give you an overview of my research in relation to the politics of death and to connect it to interdisciplinary death studies, which is one of my research interests alongside reproductive politics. So I'll talk about my open access book, which sums up my PhD work. And I'm also going to be talking about some work I've done since, which was collaborations with colleagues from other disciplines and topic areas. Specifically, Professor Susie Kilshaw, who works on the anthropology of miscarriage, and Professors Joe Brewis, Ilaria Bunkari, and Julie Davis, who work in organisation employment studies, and Victoria Newton from health and wellbeing studies. And I think I'll probably talk for about 35 minutes, so there'll be plenty of time for questions. So do shout if for some reason the slides stop working, but at the moment you should be seeing one with some dunes on the right. My main point today is that deaths which are politically and socially contested have been a key focus for death studies and adjacent fields of inquiry across several disciplines, and this really resonates with pregnancy loss research. So, for example, Pauline Boss's work on ambiguous loss in psychology, Judith Butler's work on grievable lives in philosophy, Nancy Scheper-Hughes from anthropology about which deaths are counted and acknowledged, Ken Doka's work on disenfranchised loss in psychology, and Patricia Robson and Tony Walter on hierarchies of loss in sociology. So building on these authors, I argue that examination of experiences of death in and shortly after pregnancy sheds light on many of the political issues implicated in death studies. And the key concept of personhood is central to many of these ideas in relation to pregnancy loss and endings. So miscarriage, termination for fetal anomaly, abortion for other reasons, and also stillbirth. And some key ontological and social questions arise in relation to pregnancy loss and ending. For example, has a death actually occurred? Is it the death of a person? And are bereaved persons produced as a result? And then from that, key political questions also arise. Who decides this? How are these decisions enacted, enforced, and who does the enacting and the enforcing? And what are the consequences for people living through these events and politics in different places and at different times? So in my work, some of the key actors in terms of the politics of death are the state, biomedicine and the NHS in England, and kin related to the fetal being, especially the pregnant woman. So my talk will go through some of my work in relation to these actors and sites of political action. And I think about these questions through social science research, drawing on sociology, anthropology, and science and technology studies, which are all my background, and using theoretical approaches in critical theory, so feminist and Foucauldian approaches in particular. And I find these approaches especially useful in trying to avoid reproducing normative ideas about death and bereavement, and trying to challenge orthodoxies in wider society in relation to death and reproduction and personhood. So today I'm drawing on my multi-sited ethnographic work about women's experiences of second trimester pregnancy loss in England. And this was a feminist multi-sited ethnography investigating women's experiences, women who'd had second trimester pregnancy losses involving labour and birth in the NHS. And I conducted interviews with women and fieldwork, including participant observation in memorial events and also site visits. And the image on the slide is from a pregnancy loss memorial flower drop at Clevedon Pier near Bristol. I also carried out analysis of legislation and regulation, both for my PhD and for subsequent collaborative work that I'll be talking about. So first of all, I'm going to explain why the second trimester is an interesting site of inquiry. For those of you who don't follow this stuff closely, a human pregnancy usually lasts about 40 weeks. And in biomedicine, this is divided into 3 different time frames called trimesters. And the second trimester in the UK is defined as between 13 completed weeks and 24 weeks of gestation. And significantly, the threshold known as fetal viability is at the top end of this period of pregnancy at 24 completed weeks of gestation. And viability is connected to UK abortion control because it's easier to access an abortion up to 24 weeks than it is afterwards. And it's also connected to the definition of stillbirth because it marks the legal threshold for a pregnancy that ends without a living baby being classified as a stillbirth. But before viability, before 24 weeks, events of pregnancy loss are quite often perceived as relatively minor and insignificant, perhaps not involving the death of a person or the bereavement of kin. And my research challenges some of these assumptions. So in the second trimester, a pregnancy can end in several ways, and they're illustrated on this slide. You can have a spontaneous premature labour, which is too early for the fetal being to survive long term, but sometimes it could be born alive. You could have a spontaneous fetal death, and this might require the medical induction of labour to remove the fetal body. You can have a termination for fetal anomaly, which is also usually an induced labour, and I'll get onto that a bit later. And you can have other forms of abortion under specific circumstances up to the point of legal fetal viability only, or if threatening the life of a pregnant woman, then beyond that too. And this type of ending can be a surgical ending in the NHS. So my research involved any ending of pregnancy in the second trimester, which was managed by labour and birth rather than surgically. So in practice, I looked at the 3 endings in yellow on the slide. And in these cases, the usual way that the NHS deals with the situation of very premature labour or a fetus which has died, or where death is planned in a termination for fetal anomaly, the NHS requires the pregnant woman to go through a labour and birth, sometimes induced. And when this happens, the stage of physical development of the fetus means there's likely to be a formed and recognisably human body which is born. And on top of this, things like the length of the pregnancy at this point, feeling fetal movement, seeing ultrasound images of the fetus, using fetal Dopplers to hear the heartbeat, and seeing the visibly pregnant shape of the pregnant woman all mean that social constructions of the fetal being as a baby and a person may be really advanced in the second trimester. And also, as I mentioned, some babies are born alive and live briefly, which I'll come back to later. So the women who took part in my research had losses in all of the 3 categories that I looked at, and they also had living children and pregnancy losses in other trimesters of pregnancy, and some of them had experience of other forms of abortion, meaning they were really often in a position to make meaningful comparisons between the experiences that they'd had. Before I get into my findings, I'm going to briefly touch on my use of language because it's really loaded and political when you talk about fetal being or pregnancy. So there isn't any neutral language to define the new being which is produced in a pregnancy, because fetus is a biological term which applies to all mammals, and it can exclude human personhood claims in some abortion arguments. But using the term baby is really politically loaded because of anti-abortion campaigning. On the other hand, in common speech and during a lot of NHS care, the most frequently used term was and is baby. And one of my participants, Natalie, summed this up on the slide. She said, as soon as you find out you're pregnant, you tell everyone I'm having a baby, not I have a fetus in my uterus. So you can see that pregnancy starts this process of person building, and it would make a difference in Natalie's case if you then said the fetus died or the baby died. They're slightly different things. And lots of other feminist work has tried to grapple with this issue around language. And you might have noticed that I've used the term fetal being a few times, and I quite like that because it's quite usefully ambiguous. But if I'm talking about the biomedical concept, I use the term fetus. Or if I'm talking about someone's specific pregnancy, I use the term that they used, whether this is baby or fetus. Similarly, in terms of language, names are really important in the politics of contested personhood, which parts of my research deal with. And the image that you can see on this slide is the names of babies who've died written on pebbles in a memorial garden. So I had to put a lot of thought into the use of names in my work. And what I ended up doing was offering choices about participant anonymity to the women that I interviewed. And some of them asked to use their real names, and I used those in publications. For the other people, I pseudonymized the women that wanted it in the bulk of the text, but I didn't pseudonymize the names of their babies who died. For those, I used the kinship terms that the women themselves used, like daughter or son, if that was appropriate, or I used the biomedical term fetus if they wanted me to use that. These considerations also led me to offer acknowledgement of the real names of participants and their babies in the communication of the research, which you'll see at the end of the talk, and which I also include in publications. I'm also using the term pregnancy loss, and this is because all the women in my study experience some form of loss, but I don't want to imply that everyone having a second trimester ending of pregnancy necessarily has a loss, nor that loss isn't felt in other circumstances. And this will become relevant to the hierarchies of loss section of the talk later on. But I am deliberately including abortion as a possible loss in my analysis, which is a political position in itself. So my plan is to lead you through women's experiences of second trimester pregnancy loss in England, highlighting some of the aspects of this experience in relation to fetal personhoods and second trimester death, looking at biomedicine and the NHS, the state, and fetal kin, especially the pregnant woman. So starting with biomedicine as represented in NHS care in England, I want to talk through the effects of this with regard to fetal and very premature neonatal death in the second trimester. A key factor here is that potential outcome of pregnancy determines much of the biomedical care during second trimester loss. And this is because of an interaction between biomedicine and law, which determines personhood, meaning whether an entity is understood as a morally charged being who has rights and statuses, including and potentially as a citizen. Because of abortion, a fetus is not legally a person in the UK until it's a living being completely separated from the body of a woman or pregnant person. And this means it can be acted on during pregnancy as simply part of her body, for example, in an abortion scenario. But once a fetus is separate, and if it's still alive, it's immediately a person with rights, which biomedicine, the NHS and the state have to protect. On the other hand, a fetus which is born dead, for example, after fetal death, has no legal status unless it's born after 24 weeks, at which point it's a stillborn baby, and it does have some limited status in relation to the state, which will come up again in the talk later. The control of whether a baby is alive after a birth is given to doctors because only they can certify life. And they also have control over whether a fetus has reached the 24 weeks gestation threshold, which might mean that they had become a stillbirth rather than a miscarriage. So only doctors can determine the gestational age of a born baby and therefore whether it's stillborn or not. And the image you can see on this slide is a posthumous ultrasound image of a baby who died at 19 weeks, shared with permission of his mother. And death during pregnancy like this means that there's no official personhood in this case. So this state of affairs has consequences for the way that second trimester pregnancy loss is managed in medical care. So, for example, where the intention is that the fetus should die in a termination for fetal anomaly, doctors are sometimes unwilling to risk a live birth, and they require that feticide is carried out. And this is a process which involves stopping the fetal heart by injecting potassium chloride before birth through the pregnant woman's abdomen so that the fetus is definitely born dead. And this is a very difficult thing, potentially, for pregnant women to undergo. And the reason that this happens is that the abortion law in England means that abortion is a criminal act with some exceptions. And doctors are really incentivized by the criminalization of abortion to be extra cautious in this space and for there to be no ambiguity about what's happened, so that it was definitely not a live birth in any way. At the same time, it's only when the fetus might have a chance of life that some other standard interventions like emergency caesarean birth are put in place. So if very close to 24 weeks, there's a possibility that that might be offered, but it won't be offered routinely otherwise. So alongside this then, a key point about second trimester pregnancy loss is that the NHS almost always requires the pregnant woman to labour and birth the fetal body, rather than removing it surgically, either through caesarean section or through the cervix. And the removal through this general idea of requiring women to labour and birth is represented as unproblematic to them during their care, but at least part of the reason is the resources it would take to offer surgical resolution. There aren't enough doctors in the NHS trained or willing to do the surgery through the cervix, which also requires general anaesthetic, and similarly with offering caesarean sections. So all of this comes about because of the potential outcome of pregnancy, a living baby or not a living baby, determines much of the biomedical care. And this is a biopolitical strategy, which is concerned with population level health. For example, it reduces the birth of disabled babies, or it ensures that a born baby has an increased chance of survival. But these additional interventions are not offered when the fetus won't live. And this is played out through state healthcare in England because the NHS is state healthcare provision. So the main idea, which I found to be underpinning all the experiences of second trimester loss that I encountered, was that in the English context, the whole idea of pregnancy is about outcome, and that our outcome should be a healthy living baby. And this is a development of sociologist Sarah Franklin's concept of fetal teleology, whereby a fundamental understanding of an embryo or fetus is that it will become a baby. In my work, it's pregnancy and its production of new persons and new kinship relationships, such as motherhood, which is entirely dependent on the birth of a living baby. So the actual reality of the pregnancy and the persons and the relations that it produces are called into question potentially by second trimester pregnancy loss. And this has an effect on the agency and resistance which some women use in seeking to define their own pregnancies, as I'll show later in the talk. So the basic idea is that pregnancy itself is defined by a teleological ontology. It's defined by the end result of pregnancy. And this is a form of ontological politics related to who gets to state the reality of pregnancy, personhood, and kinship. And consequently, if these end in death, what has happened? So pregnancy is understood through its outcome, it's biopolitical, and where pregnancies don't fit the model of being able to produce a living baby at the end of it, disciplinary mechanisms are used to produce deviance by making claims that the pregnancy wasn't a real pregnancy, it wasn't really a baby, the pregnant woman isn't really a mother. And this is ontological politics. And in my book, I detail how this state of affairs affects the care offered to women experiencing second trimester loss. So, for example, it resulted in obstetric violence, such as lack of informed consent for procedures or withholding of pain medication. But I won't go into that for this talk. Having mentioned some of the legal issues around personhood and the fetal being, I'm now going to explain this context a bit further and discuss the state governance consequences of second trimester loss. So, as I've explained, in theory, no fetus has any form of personhood, which is an argument often used to bolster the right to abortion. So the threshold for personhood is live birth, at which point a fetus emerges from the pregnant woman. It's medically defined as a neonate, and it's considered to have legal personhood, which requires birth registration with the state as a citizen. And this relationship ends with the state, the relationship with the state only ends on the death of the person. So by this logic, a fetal being that's born dead, for example, in miscarriage or abortion, isn't considered any form of legal person, and it's not registered by the state, and there's no relationship of a living citizen with the state, which to that point makes an amount of sense. But the actual situation is then complicated by the status of stillbirth, where after 24 weeks of gestation, this magical threshold again, a fetal being which is born dead is registered with the state on a special separate register, the stillbirth register, with a personal name and with the names of its parents. And this registration is also required in cases of termination of pregnancy after 24 weeks. So stillbirth, which is defined by the viability threshold at the upper end of the second trimester, allows a degree of attenuated personhood recognition. And importantly, this registration allows parents access to the same benefits and statuses as a live-born baby, like maternity leave and pay. But if a pregnancy loss occurs before that 24-week threshold, there aren't any entitlements unless there's a live birth. And a live birth trumps all gestational timeframes as long as it's medically diagnosed. So a parent thinking that they see movement or a heartbeat after a second trimester birth doesn't count. It has to be validated by a doctor. And if there is a confirmed live birth before 24 weeks, civil registration as full birth and death is required, and it acts as the gateway to benefits and statuses for parents whose baby died. So for some people in my research, there was a really big contrast between the consequences depending on where the death occurred, whether it was inside or outside the pregnant woman's body, and at what point in pregnancy. For example, one of my participants, Charlie, lost 2 daughters around the 24-week threshold, and she was able to register the one that was born alive, but not the one who died during the birth. And a different participant, Alice, was required to register her baby girl as a stillbirth who died after 24 weeks because she died through termination for fetal anomaly. But she wasn't allowed to register the baby boy who also died as a consequence of termination, but at 17 weeks. So these consequences are very real in people's lives. As well as recognising personhood, civil registration acknowledges kinship when it registers the names of parents in relation to babies, and it produces effects in relation to the allocation of non-medical resources for the kin of the registered person. And it also affects the disposal of the body of babies and fetuses who've died. So, a registered person is connected to kin through time in the official record and through naming. But fetal beings that haven't been registered as persons aren't recorded in relation to kin. A registered person acts as the gateway to resources for things like maternity and paternity leave, financial resources, bereavement leave and pay, and so on. But a fetal being that isn't registered as a person doesn't entitle the kin to any resources apart from sick pay when the pregnancy ends. And a registered person means that the parents are responsible for the disposal of the body because it's the corpse of a child. But on the other hand, fetal beings that are not registered count as pregnancy remains, and you actually don't need legal consent for disposal, although it is advised. So it doesn't matter how the pregnant person themselves might define the pregnancy, or whether they think that the fetal being or baby was a person or a non-person, or whether they consider themselves to be kin or not kin to it. It's all predefined by the law on live personhood and stillbirth as administered by biomedicine. So I've developed this registration and kin entitlements work into a paper on the reproductive governance of employment leave for all pre-24-week pregnancy endings, including other types of abortion, with some of the co-authors that I mentioned earlier. And in this, we define the current state of play and examine various proposals for change in the UK context. And this is published in Gender, Work and Organisation, if you're interested. On a human level, access to civil registration and the associated benefits have a big impact on people's lives. So someone I'm calling Holly was 25 in 2019 when she talked to me about the death of her daughter, and who died in the second trimester a year earlier. The baby had died during birth at 21 weeks gestation, so about halfway through the pregnancy. And in my interview with Holly, she was really upset about the lack of recognition of her baby as a person, especially in relation to exclusion from state birth registration. This was because state birth registration for the women in my study represented an official acknowledgement of personhood. And Holly said to me she was a person. I still don't understand why they can't. There has to be a level of pregnancy when they say we can't do it. But she was a fully formed baby. She had fingernails, she had everything. And I think she was alive. Why? I don't understand why they can't be registered like any other baby is. So Holly said to me that she felt she'd get more recognition of loss if her dog died than she did about the death of her baby. She wasn't able to claim any time off except sick leave, and this meant that she lost her job as a care worker as a result of the pregnancy loss. She wasn't eligible for financial support as she would have been with a stillbirth. So for Holly, this experience was the death of a baby and who was a person, and a daughter who was a sibling to her older child. But in hospital, the baby was referred to by staff as a fetus, and the presence of Holly's wider family at the birth was disapproved of. So for Holly, lack of official acknowledgement of the death of her daughter as a real baby and herself as a bereaved mother was really problematic. So this leads me to the final part of the talk, which considers the politics around death at the level of family and kin. So as Holly said in the last quote, she thought her pregnancy loss for her involved the death of a person. And she described this person as her daughter and as kin to her and to her family. And she refuted the minimization of her experience of loss. And like many other women who experienced the definition of their pregnancy loss by biomedicine and the law, and fundamentally disagreed with this, Holly spoke against this way of defining things. So I want to explain now how agency and resistance as political acts were practiced by those women who considered themselves to experience the death of a person. And this wasn't everybody in my research, and I want to make sure that we keep open the option for for some people that personhood isn't created at this point in pregnancy. Then I'm going to go on after this to describe how power and politics were invoked in relation to hierarchies of loss within and around pregnancy loss. And you've probably already clocked this a little bit in relation to Holly's comment about social responses to the death of her baby or her dog, and the way that Charlie only had one of her babies registered. And the image you can see on this slide is memorial hand and footprints of one of the babies whose mother took part in my research, used with her permission. So the two claims which take the form of resistance to prevailing norms around pregnancy loss are that this pregnancy did make a person, and the pregnant woman and other family members are kin to it, and therefore a bereavement has occurred. And women who are faced with a biomedical, legal and social denial of the reality of their pregnancy, motherhood and loss can turn to a ready-made alternative ontological position to back up what they feel has happened to them. And this position is the norms of English kinship as described by anthropologists Marina Strathern and Jeanette Edwards. They didn't talk about it in relation to pregnancy loss, they just talked about it more generally. And they say that in England, family is based in natural ties between persons, that persons are separate individuals located in material human bodies prior to and separately from relations with other persons. And kinship in England as a consequence is to some degree optional. People can opt in or out. You can have nothing to do with your dad, for example, or you can have favourite cousins and ones that you don't have anything to do with. And kinship relations are potentially really diverse. So I argue that these ideas about kinship and personhood act as an ontological basis for claiming second trimester personhood and kinship, because in England, these ideas underpin what is understood as a person and who can be kin or relatives. So just to go through how this works in relation to second trimester pregnancies, in English kinship, persons exist in human bodies. In second trimester pregnancy, a second trimester fetal being has a human body. In English kinship, people can choose to be kin or not kin. In a second trimester pregnancy, people can defy the official or accepted definitions of kinship and make claims about personhood and kinship themselves. Emotions are really important in English kinship in terms of defining relationships between people, and this allows in second trimester pregnancy loss for the possibility of grief. In English kinship, some people are especially important in mediating kinship, and identity flows from parent to child. And in second trimester pregnancy loss, this means that mothers and fathers can define the being that was produced in the pregnancy as a person and as their baby. In English kinship, death isn't a barrier to continued personhood, and it's not a barrier to continued social identity. And in second trimester pregnancy loss, personhood can exist in prenatal death and also posthumously. And in English kinship, not everybody does the same things. And in second trimester pregnancy loss, not everybody does the same things. So I found that women use these ideas in the politics of second trimester pregnancy loss in various ways. Some women used evidence from biomedicine to claim the legitimacy of the fetal body as a human body, and therefore to claim fetal personhood. For example, using scan pictures or photos or heartbeat recordings. Some women challenged exclusion from civil registration, and they did this through naming, by naming their babies with either personal and or family names, making claims about both personhood and also kinship and belonging within a family group. And some women presented their babies alongside other living babies or family dead, for example, online or in the home, to make this really strong statements about their inclusion as persons and kin. So I'll just give you a few examples of this from my participants. Phoebe here is describing how her embodied experience of labour and birth and her baby's body made him a person. And she says, people say you didn't have a baby, but I did. You know, it's not the normal birth story. It's not the normal labour story, but I can tell you I had a baby. Whereas people who've never been through it or know about it don't associate the fact that I did actually give birth to a person. Yes, he's not here. It's no different if I did it at 40 weeks. He's a person. I saw him. He's got fingernails, you know. And I don't think it's really hard for other people to comprehend that he was a person and it did actually happen. And one of the things you might notice there again is that detail of fingernails on the baby's body as a sign of human completeness. thinking about the use of naming in relation to personhood claims, which connects into civil registration, Tamsin described why she named her twins, who were found to have no heartbeat at 17 weeks gestation. And she said, it was important to me to have that they had a name. And I said, can you explain why? And she said, not really, although she then did just explain it, because she said, it made them a real being, because I found it really hard with the first miscarriage, and this was a separate loss that she'd had in the first trimester. A lot of comments you get from people are, well, at least it wasn't a real baby yet, or at least it wasn't further along. And I felt as though with that pregnancy that nobody really saw it as a baby. And it was really important to me that the twins were seen as babies, almost on a similar level to my daughter. I wanted people to know that they were my babies. And I just want to point out the way here she makes a contrast with an earlier loss not involving a formed fetal body, and also that she doesn't quite attribute the same level of personhood to her twins as she does to her living daughter, although she wants them more in that category than in the early miscarriage. And finally, in relation to creating family links with the fetal being as a person, Angela kept her son's ashes in her home alongside his Scanish images. And she said, people ask, and I say, he's on our Welsh dresser. It's kind of like a thing now, but he's here with us if it makes any sense. And he'll always come with us now, whether we move house or what have you. We don't want to make a shrine, but it's there, it's present. It's not a big deal. You wouldn't necessarily walk in and notice it. So it's discreet. It's not a shrine. We keep his scan pictures because that's the only picture we got of him other than the snaps we took after he died. Just feels like he's with us. And then we'll tell our newborn second son about him. And he'll ask and we'll say, he's there on our Welsh dresser. So you can see how these women were asserting the personhood of their babies and their own motherhood and kinship with them in the face of this being questionable in second trimester pregnancy loss. They were performing political resistance and also exercising personal agency in their claiming of fetal personhood, in their claiming of the death of a person, and then their claims about their own bereavement. So some of those quotes will resonate with this bit of the talk, because since my PhD, I've worked with anthropologist Susie Kilshaw to think a bit more about the politics of loss in pregnancy. And we brought our data together, hers from early miscarriage and mine from late miscarriage and termination for fetal anomaly, to develop Robson and Walter's concept of hierarchy of loss. And this is a paper in the Omega Journal of Death and Dying. So Robson and Walter in 2013 in that journal were critiquing Ken Doka's concept of disenfranchised grief. And they were saying it's not that grief is either allowed or not allowed, enfranchised or disenfranchised in a binary way, but instead that it exists on a spectrum. So you get more or less social acknowledgement. And they found that this was determined by the closeness of the bereaved person to the person who died. So, for example, a partner might have more claim to social acknowledgement than a colleague. So Susie and I found that this was the case in pregnancy loss. Excuse me. So, for example, the person who'd been pregnant was often considered to be more affected than her male partner. But also, we found that several other factors are implicated in hierarchies of loss. So one of these is positions on what was actually lost, and this affects the degree of recognition. So especially important in our work was the status of the dead fetal being. And this was affected by ideas about gestational age, the loss being worse later in pregnancy, especially after 24 weeks, and also ideas about the physical state of the baby. For example, when other people said a miscarriage must have had something wrong with it, and implying that the loss was less important if the fetus was damaged. And similarly, termination for fetal anomaly would often conceptualize as a lesser loss because the fetus was damaged or would be disabled. Another factor was what else was lost. So, for example, if the pregnancy was the first pregnancy, perhaps claims to motherhood became tenuous if the person didn't have a living child. The intention behind the loss was also political in relation to the circumstances of loss. So whether someone had chosen to abort a pregnancy might diminish their claim to loss. And this paper returned to the story of Charlie, who was really adamant that her 2 spontaneous losses around 24 weeks were more genuine than a termination for fetal anomaly experienced by her friend. The significance of pregnancy loss was also compared to other personal losses, such as the loss of a parent. And sometimes this either diminished or amplified the sense of loss in relation to the the pregnancy loss. It was also compared to the losses of others, like Charlie's example, or women who had second trimester losses feeling that theirs was more impactful than their friends who had first trimester losses, for example. So you can see from this that we've found that hierarchies of loss are not just imposed from outside, but they're used normatively and agentially by the people implicated in the loss, sometimes to claim more legitimacy for their own loss or to position their loss in relation to the losses of others. And I'm quite interested in whether our findings here resonate in other bereavements beyond pregnancy loss. So just to bring the talk to a close, hopefully I've given you an overview of the politics of death in relation to pregnancy loss. And circling back to those questions about pregnancy loss and death from the beginning of the talk, complicated questions like, has a death actually occurred? Is it the death of a person? Are bereaved persons produced as a result? And the political aspects of this as well. Who decides this? How are these decisions enacted and enforced, and who by? And what are the consequences for people living through these events and these politics in different times and different places? And we can see how nuance and complexity is added in by biomedicine, the state, the family, and the kin of putative or potential fetal persons who may also themselves be bereaved. So second trimester pregnancy loss examined like this contributes to knowledge about reproductive politics, but it also contributes to knowledge about death. And this is knowledge which goes beyond descriptive accounts of experiences of death to analyse ideas and structures and institutions and individual responses as component parts of a complex whole. So if you'd like to read more about this, my book is open access with Berghahn Books, and one chapter of it is a development of a paper published in Mortality about the governance of the dead fetal body. The other papers I've referred to in the talk are published open access by Omega Journal of Death and Dying and Gender Work and Organisation, and they're really easy to find online as well. So just thanks to my co-authors who I've mentioned earlier in the talk, and the quick slides with their permission, as mentioned as well, in acknowledgement of the contribution of my participants, and in memory of their babies, including those that were mourned but not named. I also wanted to mention my next project. So I'm going back to the University of Exeter in a couple of weeks to look at fetal personhood in relation to the cervical stitch, also known as cerclage. And this is a project that's in the sociology and anthropology of reproduction, but I think it will have findings in relation to ambiguities about preventing death. So I'm hoping to have some more to say in death studies in the future. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you so much, Aimee. That was absolutely fascinating. My mind is quite blown at being someone who doesn't work in this area at all, really. But yeah, I very much welcome questions from everyone who was listening. You can either type them in the chat or feel free to raise your hand or just simply unmute and ask. Oh, thanks for that comment, Julie. But don't worry, bye for now.
Bye, Julie.
Would anybody like to ask a question?
Or tell me if any of this resonates with your work. That was what I was interested, particularly the hierarchies of loss stuff. Has anyone come across this in a different way? I don't actually know what sort of work people do that are here, to be honest.
Yeah, I was personally quite interested in the notion of personhood. I mean, again, it's something that I've only touched on quite briefly on the sort of periphery of teaching and whatnot in relation to grief. And I know that Douglas Davies, who you know I've worked alongside for a fair few years now, has spoken quite a bit about the notion of individual personhood rather than focusing on the individual. And I thought that that was quite relevant to what you were talking about.
Well, interestingly, that's a concept from Marilyn Strathern, who was the person who defined English kinship. But she came up with that concept in relation to Melanesian kinship, which is where she did some other field work. So, yeah, the idea that the person's socially situated rather than specifically in the way that English kinship is in a body as a separate being. And that it's really interesting that because it does really affect outcomes, both in terms of reproduction and in terms of death, as to what you think has started or ended in a case of birth, pregnancy and birth, or death, is how the ideas of personhood are constituted and what makes a person. And that's why it was really important for my work to situate this in England, because of the stuff about the importance of the body as the person. The body is to some degree the person in our culture, whereas in other cultures sometimes the social connections might create personhood more. They might be the thing that is the person. So I think that's super interesting, and there's so much. I mean, personhood is this really fuzzy concept, and it's got, in anthropology, it's got the history of being looked at across cultures, but it is really quite a fuzzy thing. And then it overlaps with legal personhood, which is a very specific thing. And it's that idea of, one of the things that I'm keen to do is to break up the legal personhood thing as just one way of seeing the world, that you're either a citizen or you're not, or you're and actually, you know, it has ramifications in all sorts of things, including like migration and citizenship and so on, like who is defined as a person in relation to a specific state and who has status. And obviously looking at it in pregnancies is a different approach, but this central idea is quite interesting. And I think it also connects to some of the stuff about when people don't know if who a person is who's died, for example. What does that do? You know, what remains if you've just got an unidentified body, for example, in a situation of war or in a situation of neglect or whatever. How much of a person is there depends on the culture and what you need to do about that in terms of disposal or in terms of trying to track people down that are relatives or whatever. All depends on your initial ideas about what a person is and what you're dealing with in this particular situation. So it does have, personhood itself has these sort of wider ramifications in relation to death studies, I think. But it is quite a slippery concept, and it moves across between social science, anthropology, and legal studies, which in again an interesting way. But what do we mean by a person? And yet we all have this sort of basic idea that there's a difference between a human and, I don't know, a tree or something else. You know, there's a sort of what's been referred to as supercharged moral element in relation to human persons. But obviously there are a lot of people make claims about other forms of personhood as well, which is another area of interest.
Yeah, it's fascinating, isn't it? Because like the law is effectively based on societal norms, you know, otherwise they wouldn't be formed. But then the way that actually then plays out in terms of what is culturally normative within a particular society, and how, you know, particularly in the British context, I mean, our laws quite old in like every regard, you know, and how that might shift based on changing experiences.
And I think one of the interesting things for second trimester loss in the British context is just that these other laws from other things like abortion law, or which actually dates back to the 19th century and also the 1960s Act, but you know, all impact on other things. So obviously part of my research was with people that were having abortions, but it also impacts on the people that weren't, and it also impacts on stillbirth and all these other things that you wouldn't necessarily think of as being connected to that the law of about 24-week viability. So that those interconnections are really interesting. But one of the things that I think is really important is not to lose sight that they're really culturally situated and specifically situated. That's why I use the term English kinship, for example, because it's not even necessarily the same as Scottish or Welsh approaches. And one of the problems that happens, particularly in terms of reproductive politics, but potentially also in terms of death and death studies, is people making very grand statements as if this stuff applies everywhere. And this happens a lot with abortion law and personhood in relation to abortion. Often the American narrative really dominates, for example, or the narrative here dominates, and we think this is the law everywhere, and it really isn't. It's not the law anywhere, it's not the convention anywhere, everywhere. And it's keeping that nuance and difference alive rather than assuming that the things that we might find either here or somewhere else in some English-speaking country or something are the ones that apply everywhere. And I think that bearing that in mind is really important.
Absolutely. Sarah?
Just
I'm doing some research around stillbirth before 1985, and
oh
a lot
wow.
of things you've said really resonate with me, with what I've been discovering, particularly around naming and registration. I was interested that at the moment there's a campaign for people who had babies stillborn long ago to be able to add the baby's name to their old certificates.
Oh, that's interesting. I
Yeah,
didn't know about that. Yeah.
yeah, they haven't had any success yet, but they're pushing on with it.
I
I
wonder
also,
if, oh, sorry, go on.
yeah, there was also one woman who wrote how she added it on herself. She just wrote it onto the certificate, taking her own agency in this.
That's really interesting.
Yeah, and there
Yeah.
was another bit that was fascinating, is that I read that so a stillbirth certificate is private, is very private. No one can access it other than the parents, or if the parents are dead, the siblings can. And in Ireland, I think they've just got the possibility to put your stillborn baby's name on a public register if you choose to. And I thought that was very interesting.
Yeah, that's really interesting. That was really
Yeah,
big in my work as well, that for some people, but not everybody, it was interesting. Some people really wanted that family connection through time, that you could search on a family tree, and they were saying things like, you know, people could look back in 100 years and see that I had 3 children, not 2 children, and things like that. But you can't do that with the stillbirth register, and that's one of the biggest differences with it, partly because it wasn't invented as a memorialization system. It was invented as a crime prevention, infanticide prevention system. So then adding names became a new thing when SANS and all those organizations started campaigning for it. So it's sort of shifted over time again and had different impacts. And one of the things I think the group that you're talking about will probably come up against with this is that because there's now a pregnancy loss certificate that you can apply for from the government, that they'll probably get pushed in that direction to just where you can just get your own certificate off the website where you can register a pregnancy loss. And that's really interesting because that sorts out the problem for some people, but for other people in my research, they were like, oh, I don't want a fake certificate. I don't want this version that you can just type into the internet and it prints it off for you. And the other thing that's really interesting about that is that there wasn't the connection to the resources that both were useful to people and also validated their bereavement. So if you have a pregnancy loss certificate, it's not an official document. It doesn't give you access to maternity leave. It doesn't give you access to bereavement pay and things like that. So people were like, well, what's the point then? But then for other people, it was really important to have that certificate. So that's like keeping that, for me, like not putting everybody in the same box is really important. And it was the same with the pregnancy loss certification, because that came in just after my PhD. And it's not necessarily an answer for everybody. And it also effectively could standardize the response to bereavement, that for some people maybe that isn't what they want, but there's a sort of push to, oh, get yourself the certificate, you know, have a funeral or whatever. And some people in my research really didn't want to do that. And then other people in my research didn't want to do the public aspect of it. So they did feel very bereaved, but they wanted to be private about it. So the person that I mentioned, Alice, that lost 2 babies to termination from fetal anomaly, they were very much babies to her, but she didn't name them. And she didn't name them because she didn't want them to have a public name, because they'd never been in the world. And it was a whole kind of really considered response to her as to why she didn't do naming, but she still considered them to be forms of person. And I thought that level of nuance is really interesting, that some people really think this stuff through and they take really specific positions. One of the other things that happened was that Charlie's first baby that died was in a relationship that ended, and then she got together with someone and had her second loss, and that man gave his surname to the first baby, and they buried the 2 babies in the same grave with the same surname that was the same surname of the whole family. And those sort of like really agential changes to things were really important in how people dealt with the bereavement. And I've seen a lot of pictures of the headstone with these 2 babies' names with the same surname, even though actually biologically their fathers were different. And I think that's a really interesting response. So is your work in history then, Sarah?
It's sort of autoethnographic, so it's about my response to looking for my own stillborn brother, but also I'm collecting public testimony that's sort of in newspapers and media and research reports from women who had a baby between 1945 and 1985.
That sounds great, really interesting. Yeah.
It's interesting as well about personhood, though, because I'm interested in the idea of collective remembrance. And when I looked up about the law regarding who you can name, although you can find, because a stillborn baby's never lived, it's considered, I think, still part of the mother's private medical information. So as far as I can tell, I'm not allowed to mention any baby stillborn after 1940 because it's like private information, even though the name is on find a grave documents and things on that, and you can find the information, but it's actually still private information unless it was over I think it's 86 years for so that would make the adult at least 100.
Yeah, that's fascinating, isn't it? And also that the implication that there's some sort of stigma involved in having had that loss.
Yes. Yeah.
That is very interesting.
Yeah.
There's a load of stuff in the comments, I think. Actually, I've just seen yours, Hayley.
Yeah, there's Hayley and Annie as well. Annie in India. Well done for being up so late.
Oh, well, yeah. Fertility treatment. Oh, yes, I can imagine. That sounds really interesting. So hopefully, I hope this has been some use to people, and it's kind of sparked some ideas for your own work, because they all sound really interesting. And I think there's a lot in it, but it's just trying to take it in the direction that it works for you, I suppose. But yeah, there's another message on there. Huh.
Yes, all lots of prayers for you, Aimee.
Oh, yeah. Oh, thank you, everybody. Thank you for turning up. And
yeah, are there any final thoughts from anybody before we wrap up for this afternoon, or questions for Aimee? You shared your details in the slides, right? So I'm sure if anyone can get in touch with you if they'd like to follow up as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and lovely to meet you all virtually, apart from Hayley that I know anyway, actually.
Yeah, no, it's been absolutely brilliant. I'm really pleased that we've had you today. Very grateful on behalf of ASDS. As I mentioned at the start, this event today was part of a series that we're running, so you can find other events that are upcoming. It's sort of one a month that we're doing. So please do sign up, or if you'd like to propose your own event, you can do that too. This is a short form to fill out, which I'll put the link in the chat. But otherwise, well, thank you all for coming, and hopefully see you at future events. And thank you again to Aimee very, very much.
Thank you for having me. All right. Hope to see you again, everybody. Okay, bye.